Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has accused Russia of planning to blow up a hydroelectric dam in the Kherson region. He said Russian troops had mined the Kharkova plant to trigger what Zelenskyy called a catastrophe of a grand scale. As winter approaches, there is growing concern about Russian attacks on energy infrastructure. There are reports this morning of blasts in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia.
Monuments destroyed. Windows of homes blown in. Residents of the southern Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv are once again picking up the pieces after the city was hit by Russian drones and missiles. Ukraine accuses Russia of using hundreds of Iranian drones in its attack in recent weeks. That's something both Moscow and Tehran adamantly deny. But an unfortunate gaffe from a Russian military expert who didn't realize he was on air suggests otherwise.
Well, we all know the drones are Iranian, but the government has not admitted to it.
Washington says that Iran is actually training Russian troops on how to use their drones or UAVs.
We assess that Iranian military personnel were on the ground in Crimea and assisted Russia in these operations. Russia has received dozens of these UAVs so far and will likely continue to receive additional shipments in the future.
With Russia's progress on the battlefield stalling, Moscow has stepped up attacks on infrastructure like power plants. Ukraine's president has accused his Russian counterpart of wanting Ukrainians to freeze to death over the winter and appealed to citizens to curtail their energy use. In Kiev, the new energy-saving guidelines are already being followed. More than half of the trolley buses are no longer running.
We switched off all electric appliances at home. The new guidelines have to be taken very seriously. So far, we've not used the heating.
Ukraine says Russia has destroyed over 30% of its power stations in just a week. If that continues, Ukrainians are going to be in for a very cold and dark winter.
We can now speak to Petro Poroshenko. He was president of Ukraine from 2014 to 2019. Mr. Poroshenko, how do you interpret Putin's recent escalation of the war with attacks on energy facilities? Is it an act of desperation?
I think this is the gesture of, first of all, gesture of revenge, and the gesture of the situation of the very bad things, and for Russia. Putin just tried to weaponize the cold weather, because now in Ukraine is start to be really cold, and he used blackmail. A few weeks ago, he used a grain blackmail, blackmailing world for the hunger. Weeks he blackmailing about the nuclear contamination, attacking the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and now he blackmailing whole Ukraine with the energy crisis, with gas and oil. And just for the last 3.5 days, Ukraine received 300 missiles and drone attack on the object of the critical infrastructure of energy. What Putin expects to see today? Total blackout in Ukraine, total blackout in Kiev. And we regrouping situation. Today, for example, instead of the trolley bus, we using the bus on the street of Kiev. We introducing a lot of the generator. We learn how to live with the energy shortage during the war, and this is just another evidence that the decision of the European Parliament, for Council of Europe, for giving Ukrainian people the Sakharov Prize is absolutely right. We learn how to win the war, and we really demonstrate that Ukraine is unbreakable, and we ruin his hope that under this pressure Ukraine can capitulate. Please, Mr. Putin, we do not give you this gift.
Now, you mentioned the attacks recently on the energy facilities carried out by drones, and there are indications that they come from Iran. So it seems that Iran is slowly entrenching itself as a player in the Ukraine war. How concerning is this for you?
First of all, this is not the suspicious. We have a full list of evidence that these drones, hundreds of drones, was produced in Iran. And I think now that it is extremely important that when we invite the independent commission from the United Nations Secretary General to investigate that and see the evidence that these drones are from Iran, it is interesting reaction for Russia. And they said that if only the General Secretary allow and send the mission to Ukraine, Russia will make a pressure to the Secretary General of United Nations. So the only language who Putin understand or use, this is the language of blackmail. And the very important thing, this is the evidence what have done Iran and Belarus, that we now have a war not only with Russia, but also we have a triple country. Russia, Iran, and Belarus is an aggressor against Ukraine. And we would be very much welcome and appreciation yesterday's decision of the European Union Council for introducing the new and decisive sanction against Iran, Iranian company, Iranian people, certain person for participating in the process of killing of Ukrainians, because Ukraine pay for that with the lives of our civilian and innocent victims. And with that situation, I'm proud that yesterday me initiated in the Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada, a special statement, a special resolution, which dedicated to Iran and his role as an aggressor against Ukraine.
Petro Poroshenko there, the former Ukrainian president. Thank you very much for joining us here on DW News.
Let's bring in our correspondent in Kiev, Matthias Böllinger. Let's start off with the US accusations of Iran's involvement in supplying weapons. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, we've just heard this snippet from the Russian TV talk show where a guest admitted basically that they are Iranian, and there has never been any doubt about them being Iranian, despite the fact that they have the scripture on them where the name is inscribed is Cyrillic and is Russian, but they look exactly like these well-known Iranian drones, and they have the same components. But Russia doesn't admit it for one thing, because Iran doesn't admit it, and Iran, of course, doesn't want to draw any kind of revenge on itself, but also because it's an embarrassment for the Russian defense industry. These drones are not incredibly sophisticated. They are effective, yes, because they are relatively new means of warfare, and Ukraine is not prepared for them. But the components are pretty much commercial parts, commercial GPS systems, etc. And Russia wasn't able to manufacture anything like that or develop anything like that by itself. So it's of course an embarrassment that they have to turn to Iran.
And it all makes it sound like the Russians are running out of weapons and ammunition. Matthias, give us the latest from the front line. We're hearing about explosions in Kharkiv.
That's right, Kharkiv was hit again. Of course, when this capital, Kiev, is hit, it makes it much faster to the news and it draws much more attention. But these cities like Kharkiv, Mykolaiv are the ones that are hit frequently, systematically. They are close to the front line, so Russia has a wider range of weapons that they can use against them, and that's why Kharkiv is really a city that is suffering a lot. It's very close to the Russian border, so it can be hit directly from Russian territory with rockets, for example, that don't need to fly over a long range and that are harder to intercept because they're in the air, much shorter.
In the meantime, what is Ukraine's plan to get through the winter with so many people turning off the power or being left in the dark?
Well, there are schemes to save energy. There are many concerns, of course, that this bombing campaign against power stations will continue. There are also concerns that a dam in the southern part of the occupied territories, actually, where the fighting is going on, might be blown up by the Russians. Zelenskyy has said that the Russians had mined the dam. We don't have any information, but this is one source of power, and it's also, of course, a danger for the people living downstream. So there are many concerns at the moment. Ukraine is trying to balance out these dangers by power cuts, for example. We have people have been asked to consume less power, and it's been announced that in order to take pressure off the grid, power might be cut at some point in some parts of the country or the city for a certain period of time. They're saying no longer than 4 hours in a row, and then shifting from one area to the other. So pressure on the grid is very high, and Ukraine might need additional sources of power. Generators, maybe power imports, but that's something to be figured out yet.
Matthias, will this all mean millions more refugees as Ukrainians find somewhere else to survive, basically?
It seems to be the plan of the Russians to create more chaos also to Western countries where these refugees turn. That's openly discussed on Russian TV, that outbreaks of diseases might be the consequence of the bombings if, for example, the sewage systems are also not functioning anymore, and there are all these fantasies discussed about on Russian TV on how to create calamities for the Ukrainian population. We might very well see people leaving the places that have no heating. We've already seen the government asking people to leave, for example, Donbass, because the natural gas pipeline system is damaged so badly that they cannot provide heating for the winter. That's what the government has officially announced. But of course, Ukraine is working to prevent this from happening in larger parts of the country, because it would be really very difficult to deal with. On the other hand, many Ukrainians are saying we've lived through the 1990s where power shortages were very frequent, and where we would be sitting at candlelight in cold apartments. We will survive this time as well.
DW's Matthias Böhringer in Kiev. Well, the first of a 9,000-strong contingent of Russian troops has begun arriving in Belarus. Minsk and Moscow have announced they're setting up a joint military unit to defend Belarusian borders. The deployment comes after Belarus leader Alexander Lukashenko said his country was facing threats from both neighbouring Ukraine and its Western allies. Ukraine.
A train said to be carrying Russian military vehicles arrives in Belarus. Another apparently full of Russian soldiers. Over the last few days, Belarus's defense ministry has been releasing images like these to prove that a deal struck between it and its giant neighbour Russia is really happening.
We arrived from the central region of Russia. Well, specifically, I'm from Moscow. We've come to help the brotherly people of the Republic of Belarus to strengthen their borders and to make everyone feel how united the peoples of Russia and Belarus are.
Alexander Lukashenko announced the plan for a joint military unit more than a week ago. Minsk has since confirmed that around 9,000 Russian troops will be based in the country close to the Ukrainian border. But Lukashenko continues to deny that his country will attack Ukraine. It's no secret, though, that Russia's Vladimir Putin has been using Belarus in its war against Kiev, including launching airstrikes from there. Ukraine has already released images of its armed forces said to be training near the border with Belarus. But it had already been holding military drills in the region before the deal between Minsk and Moscow was announced. Belarus is keen to show it's giving these Russian soldiers a warm welcome. But once the show is over, no one's quite sure what will happen next.
Well, let's talk about that with Nadia Douglas. She's a political scientist working at the Centre for East European and International Studies here in Berlin. Welcome. How big of a threat is this joint Belarus-Russia military group for Ukraine?
I believe it should not be underestimated, but it doesn't represent an immediate threat. The Belarusian Defense Ministry has announced on Monday that they would hold joint military exercises within this joint regional grouping. And actually, if we remember, prior to February 24, there arrived Russian troops also under the pretext of holding military exercises, and after that we witnessed the invasion. And still, yet, I believe that this is, from the Belarusian side, yet another step towards appeasing Putin and more of a joint military threat posture to put more pressure on Ukraine.
But could it also mean another offensive on Kiev like we saw in the early stages of the war?
I don't believe that such an offensive would take place in the immediate future. There are three reasons for that. First, Putin knows that the Belarusian army is not in quite a good state, and the loyalty is not necessarily given. Secondly, also Putin and Lukashenko know that the situation is much more worse than it was in February, because Ukraine has taken precautions and has tried to fortify the Ukraine-Belarusian border by placing landmines in vast areas, blowing up bridges. And so advancing in these territories would be much more difficult this time. And third, both Putin and Lukashenko know that if Belarus would enter in this war actively, it could mean a huge destabilization for this country, because, as we know, a majority of the population is against active participation of Belarus in this war. I mentioned the loyalty of the Belarusian armed forces, and it's not as equipped and prepared. Probably there would need to be additional mobilization, and so it would be a very risky endeavor.
But whether or not they're prepared and in a good state, the Russian army is also not in a good state. How much influence does Putin have over Lukashenko?
He has big influence, because Lukashenko is under immense pressure by Russia, by Putin, ever since he de facto lost the presidential elections in August 2020 and had to falsify the results. Politically, he would never have survived if he hadn't been supported by Russia. So in the recent months, Russia has put further pressure on Belarus, for example, to agree in a increased integration in the context of the Belarusian-Russian state union. So in the field, for example, of a unified tax policy, Belarus has lost some of its economic sovereignty, and the Belarusian opposition, led by Tsikhanouskaya, they, for example, fear now that Belarus will lose eventually its political sovereignty.
Political scientist Nadia Douglas, thank you.
Thank you.